In 1940, a disabled man in Hatfield couldn't fight for his country. So he poured his heart and soul into building something that would fight for him. He wasn't alone. Across Britain, in furniture workshops and cabinet-making shops, thousands of men and women who would never wear a uniform were preparing to wage their own war against the Luftwaffe. They were furniture makers, carpenters, workers too old to enlist, too disabled to pass a physical, or simply too valuable at their benches to be sent to the front. What they built would become one of the most devastating weapons of the Second World War. An aircraft the Germans couldn't catch, couldn't stop, and couldn't believe was made of wood. This is the story of the de Havilland Mosquito. But not the story you've heard before. Not pilots and dogfights, not tactical raids and military strategy. This is about the people who built it, and specifically about what happened when de Havilland's radical production philosophy crossed an ocean. Geoffrey de Havilland founded the de Havilland Aircraft Company in 1920. By the mid-1930s, the company had moved to Hatfield, Hertfordshire, where it would grow into one of Britain's most innovative aircraft manufacturers. But here's the thing, de Havilland wasn't like other aircraft companies. While rivals had embraced all-metal construction, de Havilland had mastered something different: wood. Their DH-88 Comet won the 1934 England to Australia air race. Their DH-91 Albatross proved that wooden construction could compete with metal at the highest level. And here's what the history books often miss. De Havilland had very little experience in stressed metal construction. Other companies knew how to rivet aluminium sheets together. De Havilland knew how to work wood. What some saw as a limitation, Geoffrey de Havilland saw as an advantage. And in 1939, he decided to bet everything on it. As Britain went to war, de Havilland approached the Air Ministry with an audacious proposal. An unarmed bomber, made entirely of wood, so fast that enemy fighters simply couldn't catch it. The military establishment was sceptical, and that's putting it politely. Wooden aircraft were considered obsolete. Modern warplanes were made of metal. They carried armour. They bristled with defensive guns. De Havilland's proposal seemed like madness, but one man believed. Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman saw what others couldn't. He protected the Mosquito project from cancellation again and again, while sceptics in the establishment tried to kill it. De Havilland pressed forward, as a private venture, without official support. They weren't waiting for permission. Geoffrey de Havilland's logic was elegant. Aluminium and steel would be in short supply during a long war. Wood would not. And Britain possessed something no amount of money could buy: generations of skilled woodworkers, furniture makers, cabinet craftsmen, carpenters whose families had been working wood for 100 years. These workers couldn't build metal aircraft. That required specialized training that was already desperately scarce. But wooden aircraft? That was different. The skills that built a Windsor chair could build a warplane. High Wycombe, Buckinghamshire. For 200 years, this market town had been the heart of Britain's furniture industry. Local beechwood from the Chiltern Hills. Generations of skilled craftsmen. High Wycombe's chairs and cabinets furnished homes across the British Empire. Among the town's most respected firms was Ercole, founded in 1920 by an Italian immigrant named Lucian Ercolani. Ercole specialized in Windsor chairs, furniture that required bending solid wood into complex curves. It was demanding, precise work. The kind of work that separates a craftsman from someone who just pushes wood through machines. When the call came to redirect their skills toward the war effort, Ercole's craftsmen discovered something remarkable. The techniques that shaped elegant chairbacks translated directly into aircraft production. A high number of subcontractors were engaged in component manufacture, particularly the wooden furniture companies of High Wycombe. The town that had furnished Britain's drawing rooms was now arming its air force. Harris Liebus, one of Britain's largest furniture manufacturers, shifted to war work. Across the region, cabinet makers who had spent their careers building wardrobes and writing desks were now shaping wing ribs and fuselage formers. The same hands that had crafted mahogany sideboards were building the aircraft that would strike at the heart of Nazi Germany. For those who understand aircraft engineering, the Mosquito's construction wasn't a compromise, it was a triumph. The fuselage was built in two halves, left and right, that were joined together once complete. Each half consisted of 3 layers. An outer skin of birch plywood, a core of Ecuadorian balsa imported at considerable expense during wartime, and an inner skin of birch plywood. When bonded with casein adhesive, derived from milk protein of all things, this sandwich became what engineers call a stressed skin composite. Loads spread across the entire surface rather than concentrating in a few structural members. The result was lighter than metal, stiffer than metal, aerodynamically cleaner, no rivet heads disrupting airflow. This was proto-composite construction. 50 years before carbon fibre transformed aerospace, de Havilland's craftsmen had unlocked the same principle. 2 thin skins separated by a lightweight core, bonded into something stronger than its components. Very stiff, very strong, very smooth. But here's what made it strategically brilliant. A metalworker building aluminium aircraft needed months of specialized training. Flush riveting, complex forming, heat treatment of alloys. A woodworker building a Mosquito needed skills they already had. The tolerances were tighter, the stakes were higher, but the basic techniques were the same as building a quality chair. De Havilland didn't just design an aircraft, they designed a production system that could mobilize an entire nation of craftsmen. The British model worked. Components flowed from dozens of workshops across the Chilterns, converging at assembly points where skilled workers fitted them together with precision that would have seemed impossible for dispersed production. If one workshop was bombed, the others continued. If one supplier ran short of materials, alternatives existed. October 3rd, 1940, the Germans proved they understood the threat. A bombing raid struck the de Havilland factory at Hatfield directly. 21 workers killed, 70 injured. Civilians murdered at their workbenches. The Hatfield workforce did not waver. They returned to their benches and their tools. To abandon their work would be to surrender to the same enemy that had killed their friends. They honoured the dead the only way they could, by building more aircraft. Grief became defiance. Defiance became aircraft. But here's the question nobody in the Air Ministry could answer with certainty. Could this dispersed, craft-based production model work anywhere else? Could it scale beyond Britain's established furniture industry and traditional woodworking culture? Could it cross an ocean? The answer would come from Canada. De Havilland Canada, based at Downsview in Ontario, had been building tiger moth trainers since before the war. But tiger moths were simple machines. Fabric-covered biplanes with wooden frames, built in modest numbers for flight schools and bush pilots. Nothing approaching the complexity of the Mosquito. Nothing requiring the precision of stressed skin composite construction. When the decision was made to produce Mosquitoes in North America, the skeptics had a point. Britain's furniture makers had generations of accumulated skill. High Wycombe's craftsmen had been working wood since their grandfathers' grandfathers were apprentices. Canada had timber, endless forests of spruce and birch. But did it have the craftsmen? The answer turned out to be yes, just not where anyone expected to find them. Canada's furniture and woodworking industries provided skilled labour, workers who understood how to bend and laminate hardwoods to exacting tolerances, craftsmen who had mastered the art of shaping wood with precision. These weren't the same traditions as High Wycombe's centuries-old chair-making guilds, but they were close enough. The first Canadian-built Mosquito, serial number KB300, flew at Downsview on September 23, 1942. Think about what that date means. Less than 3 years after the first British prototype, with an ocean between the Canadian workers and the parent factory, with wartime shipping restrictions making it nearly impossible to transport the specialised tools and jigs that traditional aircraft production would have required. Wooden construction made the crossing possible. The fundamental techniques, laminating, bonding, shaping curved surfaces, could be taught to workers who already understood wood. The specialised equipment was relatively simple compared to the massive presses and forming tools needed for aluminium aircraft. A skilled carpenter in Ontario could learn the Mosquito-specific methods in weeks, not months. Canada's forests provided raw materials. The birch plywood skins could be sourced from Canadian mills. The timber needed for structural components came from Canada's vast woodland resources. The Downsview facility grew from a modest operation building training aircraft to a major production centre, turning out some of the most sophisticated combat aircraft of the war. Workers who had never imagined themselves in the aircraft industry discovered that their peacetime skills translated directly to wartime production. Workers who had shaped furniture found themselves bonding plywood skins for fuselage sections. Elderly craftsmen spent their final working years shaping wing components. Young men who couldn't pass the medical requirements for military service stood at benches alongside their fathers and built aircraft that would terrorize the Luftwaffe. The same democratic genius that had mobilized Britain's furniture makers was working in Canada. By war's end, Canadian factories had produced over 1,000 Mosquitoes. 1,000 aircraft, each one representing the same triumph of civilian mobilization that had occurred in Britain. Each one built by hands that might have belonged to a furniture worker, a woodworker, a craftsman who had never expected to contribute to aerial warfare. The production numbers tell only part of the story. The deeper truth is what those numbers represented. Proof that de Havilland's radical idea wasn't a one-time success dependent on Britain's unique circumstances. It was a model that could work wherever skilled woodworkers existed. The wooden construction that skeptics had dismissed as primitive, a desperate workaround by a company that couldn't build proper metal aircraft, turned out to be adaptable, reproducible, and devastatingly effective. Back in Britain, the Hatfield workforce continued building. Women who had never held a woodworking tool before the war became precision craftsmen. Men whose working years should have been behind them passed skills to the next generation, while their hands still shaped components. Workers with disabilities that disqualified them from combat found that their steady hands could shape aircraft parts to tolerances that would have challenged any worker. De Havilland's production managers understood that every pair of skilled hands mattered. Benches were lowered for workers in wheelchairs. Tool handles were modified for those with limited grip strength. Jigs were redesigned so that a man missing fingers on his left hand could still hold a component steady while his right hand shaped it. These weren't charitable accommodations. They were practical solutions to a simple problem. Britain needed aircraft, and these workers could build them if given the chance. The reserved occupation system exempted skilled workers from military conscription. A master cabinet maker building Mosquito components was considered more valuable at his bench than in the infantry. This carried its own burden. Men who might have wished to fight alongside their neighbours were required to remain at home, their contribution less visible but no less real. Some of them spent the rest of their lives wondering if they had done enough. Whether staying home while others went to war was really service or just self-preservation. Whether building aircraft, even aircraft as important as the Mosquito, counted as fighting. It did. It counted more than most of them ever knew. The Mosquito became the lowest loss rate aircraft in RAF Bomber Command. Let that sink in for a moment. An aircraft made of wood, designed by a company that didn't know how to build metal planes, assembled by furniture makers and carpenters and disabled workers in Britain and Canada. And it had the best survival rate in the entire bomber fleet. The basic airframe adapted to fill every role: bombers, fighters, night fighters, photo reconnaissance, pathfinders. One design, endless applications. The Luftwaffe couldn't catch it, literally couldn't catch it. A wooden aircraft, assembled in garden sheds and furniture workshops, outran the best fighters Germany could build. More than 7,700 Mosquitoes were built between 1941 and 1950. 7,700 aircraft, each one containing components shaped by hands that belonged to someone who couldn't or wouldn't wear a uniform. Someone whose contribution to victory would never appear in the official histories of battles and campaigns. The British production story is well documented. Hatfield, High Wycombe, Leavesden, the furniture companies of the Chilterns. These names appear in the histories, and rightfully so. But the Canadian story deserves equal recognition. The workers at Downsview who proved that de Havilland's model could scale across an ocean. The craftsmen who adapted their peacetime skills to wartime production without the benefit of generations of specialized tradition. The men and women who built over 1,000 aircraft, each one a weapon of war, each one a triumph of civilian mobilization. Aircraft built in the New World would serve with distinction in European skies. They carried something more than bombs and cameras. They carried proof that ordinary people, working with ordinary tools, could build extraordinary weapons. History remembers the pilots, the daring raids, the tactical innovations. And that's fair. Those men risked their lives, and many of them didn't come home. But behind every Mosquito that climbed into a grey English sky, there was a network of civilians who had built it. In Hatfield and High Wycombe, yes, but also in Downsview, in workshops across Ontario. People who couldn't fight but found a way to serve. People who took skills that had nothing to do with warfare and transformed them into weapons. The disabled man in Hatfield who shaped fuselage components at a modified workbench. The chairmaker in High Wycombe whose techniques for bending wood translated into wing ribs. The furniture worker in Ontario who discovered that the precision demanded by fine woodworking was the same precision demanded by aircraft construction. The elderly craftsman who had made furniture for 50 years and spent his final working years building something that would outlive him. They poured their hearts and souls into those aircraft. Every careful measurement, every smoothly sanded surface, every joint that fit precisely because craftsmanship demanded it. The Mosquito didn't humiliate the Luftwaffe because it was made of exotic materials or revolutionary technology. It humiliated them because thousands of ordinary people on both sides of the Atlantic, furniture makers, carpenters, cabinet makers, workers who couldn't serve in uniform, built something extraordinary. They couldn't fight, so they built the Mosquito instead, in Britain, Canada and Australia, in Hatfield and in Downsview. In workshops that had made chairs and workshops that had made cabinets. On benches modified for wheelchair users and benches staffed by women who had never worked outside their homes before the war. They built 7,700 aircraft. They achieved the lowest loss rate in Bomber Command. They proved that wooden construction wasn't a limitation. It was a superpower. And that made all the difference. If you have a connection to this story, if your grandfather worked in one of those workshops, if your grandmother shaped components at Hatfield or Leavesden or Downsview, if your family was part of this production miracle in Britain, Canada or Australia, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this.